Rascal by Sterling North, published by Puffin Books. Chapter 1, May. It was in May 1918 that a new friend and companion came into my life, a character, a personality, and a ring-tailed wonder. He weighed less than 1 pound when I discovered him, a furry ball of utter dependence and awakening curiosity, unweaned and defenseless. Wowzer and I were immediately protective. We would have fought any boy or dog in town who sought to harm him. Now Wowzer was an exceptionally intelligent and responsible watchdog, guarding our house and lawns and gardens and all my pets. But because of his vast size, 170 pounds of muscled grace and elegance, he seldom had to resort to violence. He could shake any dog on the block as a terrier shakes a rat. Wowzer never started a fight, but after being challenged, badgered, and insulted, he eventually would turn his worried face and great sad eyes upon his tormentor, and more in sorrow than in anger, grab the intruder by the scruff of the neck and toss him into the gutter. Wowzer was an affectionate, perpetually hungry Saint Bernard. Like most dogs of his breed, he drooled a little. In the house, he had to lie with his muzzle on a bath towel, his eyes downcast as though in slight disgrace. Pat Delaney, a saloon keeper who lived a couple of blocks up the street, said that St. Bernards drool for the best of all possible reasons. He explained that, in the Alps, these noble dogs set forth every winter day, with little kegs of brandy strapped beneath their chins, to rescue wayfarers lost in the snowdrifts. Generations of carrying the brandy, of which they have never tasted so much as a blessed drop, have made them so thirsty that they continuously drool. The trait had now become hereditary, Pat said, and whole litters of bright and thirsty little St. Bernards are born drooling for brandy. On this pleasant afternoon in May, Wowzer and I started up First Street toward Crescent Drive, where a semicircle of late Victorian houses enjoyed a hilltop view. Northward lay miles of meadows, groves of trees, a winding stream, and the best duck and muskrat marsh in Rock County. As we turned down a country lane past Bardine's orchard and vineyard, the signature of spring was everywhere. Violets and anemones in the grass, the apple trees in promising bud along the bough. Ahead lay some of the most productive walnut and hickory trees I had ever looted, a good swimming hole in the creek, and, in one bit of forest, a real curiosity, a phosphorescent stump which gleamed at night with foxfire, as luminescent as all the lightning bugs in the world, ghostly and terrifying to boys who saw it for the first time. It scared me witless as I came home one evening from fishing, so I made it a point to bring my friends that way on other evenings, not wishing to be selfish about my pleasures. Oscar Sunderland saw me as I passed his bleak farmhouse far down that lane. He was a friend of mine who knew enough not to talk when we went fishing, and we were trapping partners on the marsh. His mother was a gentle Norwegian woman who spoke English with no trace of an accent, and also her native language. His father, Herman Sunderland, was another kettle of Hassenpfeffer, German on his mother's side and Swedish on his father's, with a temper and dialect all his own. Oscar's mother baked delicious Norwegian pastries, particularly around Christmas time. Sometimes, in placing before me a plate of her delicacies, she would say something tender to me in Norwegian. I always turned away to hide the shameful moisture in my eyes. As Mrs. Sunderland knew, my mother had died when I was 7, and I think that was why she was especially kind to me. Oscar's tough old father presented no such problem. I doubt that he had ever said anything kind to anyone in his life. Oscar was very much afraid of him and risked a whipping if he were not at home in time to help with the milking. No one was concerned with the hours I kept. I was a very competent 11-year-old. If I came home long after dark, my father would merely look up from his book to greet me vaguely and courteously. He allowed me to live my own life, keep pet skunks and woodchucks in the backyard and the barn, pamper my tame crow, my many cats, and my faithful St. Bernard. He even let me build my 18-foot canoe in the living room. I had not entirely completed the framework, so it would take another year at least. When we had visitors, they sat in the easy chair surrounding the canoe or skirted the prow to reach the great shelves of books we were continuously lending. We lived alone and liked it, cooked and cleaned in our own fashion, and paid little attention to indignant housewives who told my father that this was no way to bring up a child. My father agreed amiably that this might well be true, and then returned to his endless research for a novel concerning the Fox and Winnebago Indians, which, for some reason, was never published.
Hi. Oh, what?
Okay, resuming the story. I'm headed for Wentworth's Woods, I told Oscar, and I may not start home before moonrise. Wait a minute, Oscar said. We'll need something to eat. He returned so swiftly with a paper sack filled with coffee cake and cookies that I knew he had swiped them. You'll get a licking when you get home. Ishkabibble, I should worry, Oscar said, a happy grin spreading across his wide face. We crossed the creek on the stepping stones below the dam. Pickerel were making their seasonal run up the stream, and we nearly caught one with our hands as he snaked his way between the stones. Killdeer started up from the marshy shallows, crying, "Killdeer, killdeer," as though a storm were brewing. Wowzer had many virtues, but he was not a hunting dog. So we were much surprised when, in Wentworth's Woods, he came to a virtual point. Oscar and I waited silently, while the St. Bernard, on his great paws, padded softly to the hollow base of a rotten stump. He sniffed the hole critically, then turned and whined, telling us plainly that something lived in that den. "Dig him out, Wowzer," I shouted. "He won't dig," Oscar predicted. "He's too lazy." "You just watch," I said loyally, but I wasn't betting any glass marbles. In another minute, Wowzer was making the dirt fly, and Oscar and I were helping in a frenzy of excitement. We scooped the soft earth with our hands and used our pocket knives when we came to old, decaying roots. "I'll bet it's a fox," I panted, hopefully. "Probably an old woodchuck," Oscar said. But we couldn't have been more surprised when a furious mother raccoon exploded from her lair, screaming her rage and dismay. Wowzer nearly fell over backward to avoid the flying claws and slashing little teeth. A moment later, the big raccoon had racked her way up a slender oak tree. 30 feet above us, she continued to scream and scold. In plain sight now, within the den, we found 4 baby raccoons, a month old perhaps. The entire litter of kits might easily have fitted within my cap. Each tail had 5 black rings. Each small face had a sharp black mask. 8 bright eyes peered up at us, filled with wonder and worry, and from 4 inquiring little mouths came whimpered questions. "Good old Wowzer," I said. "That's a pretty good dog you've got there," Oscar admitted, "but you better hold him back." "He wouldn't hurt them. He takes care of all my pets." In fact, the big dog settled down with a sigh of satisfaction, as near to the nest as possible, ready to adopt one or all of these interesting little creatures. But there was one service he could not render. He could not feed them. "We can't take them home without their mother," I told Oscar. "They're too young." "How do we catch the mother?" Oscar asked. "We draw straws." "And then what?" "The one who gets the short straw shinnies up the tree and catches her." "Oh, no," Oscar said. "Oh, no, you don't. I ain't that crazy." "Come on, Oscar." "No, sirree." But at just this moment, the 4 little raccoons set up such a plaintive quavering that we all felt miserable. We had to catch that mother raccoon. Wowzer was as sad as I was. He pointed his big muzzle toward the evening sky and howled mournfully. "Well," Oscar said, kicking his shoe into the fresh earth, "I'd better be getting home to help with the milking." "Quitter," I taunted. "Who's a quitter?" "You're a quitter." "Well, okay, I'll draw straws, but I think you're loony." I held the straws and Oscar drew the long one. "Loony?"
Yeah.
"I think you're loony. Little loony is a little crazy in the head." I held the straws and Oscar drew the long one. Naturally, I had to live up to my own bargain. I looked far above me. In the fading glow of the sunset, there she still was, 20 pounds of ring-tailed dynamite. I patted Wowzer as though for the last time and began my tough scramble up that slender trunk. As I shinnied up the tree, in no great hurry to tangle with the raccoon, I had one piece of good fortune. The full moon began to rise above an eastern hill, giving me a little more light for my dangerous maneuver. Far out on the first limb, the outraged animal took a firm stance, facing me, her eyes glowing balefully in the moonlight. "I'm going to cut off the branch with my jackknife," I told Oscar. "And then what? You're supposed to catch her when she falls in the hazel brush." Oscar suggested that I had bats in my belfry.
What does that mean?
That's kind of like cuckoo in the head, because a belfry is like a church tower and it's a really tall, and having bats in your belfry, it's just a phrase that means you're not thinking right. But he took off his corduroy jacket and prepared to throw it over the raccoon in a do-or-die effort for which he had little enthusiasm. Whittling through 2.5 inches of white oak with a fairly dull jackknife is a laborious process, as I soon discovered. I was in a cramped position, holding on with my left hand and hacking away at the wood with my right, and I feared the raccoon might try to rush me when the limb began to break. The moon rose slowly through the trees as blisters rose slowly on my right hand, but I couldn't weaken now. From far below came the whimpering of the raccoon kits and an occasional mournful howl from Wowzer. Tree toads and frogs in the swamp began their chorus, and a little screech owl, sounding almost like another raccoon, added an eerie tremolo. "How you comin'?" Oscar asked. "Comin' fine. Get ready to catch her." "Count on me," Oscar said, his voice less convincing than his brave words. The tasseled limb of the white oak sighed at last, broke with a snap, and drifted down to the hazel brush below. Oscar tried. I'll give him credit for that. He tangled for 5 seconds with that raccoon and then retreated with a damaged jacket. 3 of the little raccoons, hearing their mother's call, trundled with amazing swiftness into the hazel brush to follow her, and were gone. Oscar, however, was quick enough to cup one kit in his cap, our only reward for our labor, but reward enough, as time would prove. As nearly as we could tell, the handsome, sharply marked little animal was covered only with soft gray underfur, having few of the darker guard hairs which later gleam on the adult raccoon. He was the only baby raccoon I had ever held in my hands, and as he nestled upward like a quailed chick and nuzzled like a puppy seeking its mother's milk, I was both overwhelmed with the ecstasy of ownership and frightened by the enormous responsibility we had assumed. Wowzer romped beside us through the moonlight, often coming to sniff and lick the new pet we had found, this bit of masked mischief which had stolen his heart as well as my own. "He's yours," Oscar said sadly. "My old man would never let me keep him. He shot a coon in the chicken house just a few weeks ago." "Well, you can come and see him," I suggested. "Sure, I can come and see him." We walked in silence for a time, thinking of the injustices of the world that made so few allowances for the nature of raccoons and boys our age. Then we began talking about all the raccoons we had ever seen, and how we would feed this kid and teach him all the things he would have to learn. "I see a raccoon mother once with 5 kits, Oscar said. "What were they doing?" "She was leading them along the edge of the stream. They did everything she did." "Like what?" "Feeling around with their front paws hunting for crawdads, I guess."
What are crawdads?
Crawdads are tiny little animals in the water that look a lot like shrimp. On the horizon there were flashes of distant lightning and a low rumbling of thunder, sounding like artillery many miles away. It reminded us that the war was still raging in France, and that maybe my brother Herschel was being moved up to the front. I hated to think about that terrible war which had been killing and wounding millions of men ever since the year my mother died. Here we were, safe and remote from the war, and worrying about such small and unimportant things as whether Oscar would get a whipping when he got home, and how to feed and raise a little raccoon. As we came up the lane toward Sunderland's farmhouse, Oscar began saying, "Ishkabibble, I should worry." But he acted worried to me. When we reached his front yard, he dared me and double dared me to go up and knock on the door. Meanwhile, he hid behind a flowering spirea bush and waited to see what might happen. Oscar was wise to let me do the knocking. Herman Sunderland came storming out, swearing in German and Swedish. He was certainly angry with Oscar, and he didn't seem to like me very much either. "Where is dot no good son of mine?" It wasn't Oscar's fault, I said. I asked him to come for a walk with me, and where is he now? Well, I said. Well, what do you mean, well? We dug out a den of raccoons, I said, and here's the one we brought home. Coons, shouted Sunderland. Verdammt varmints. I was afraid that Mr. Sunderland might flush Oscar from behind the spirea bush, but at just this moment Oscar's gracious mother came out on the front porch, the moonlight shining on her silvering hair. Go to bed, Herman, she said quietly. I will take care of this. Come out, Oscar, from behind that bush. To my surprise, Oscar's father meekly obeyed, taking a lamp up that long, dark parlor stairway, his shadow much taller than himself, and Oscar's mother took us to the kitchen, where she fed us a warm supper and began to heat a little milk to the temperature that would be right for a human baby. It is hungry, the little one, she said, petting the small raccoon. Go fetch a clean wheat straw, Oscar. She filled her own mouth with warm milk, put the wheat straw between her lips, and slanted the straw down to the mouth of the little raccoon. I watched, fascinated, as my new pet took the straw eagerly and began to nurse. Look how the little one eats, Oscar's mother said. This is the way you will have to feed him, Sterling. Chapter 2. June. Do you want a second chapter? Yes? June was the month. School was out. Cherries were ripe, and all the boys and some of the girls went barefoot. Boys had many extra advantages, such as swimming naked and wandering alone along the streams and rivers, casting for bass among the water lilies. Girls had to wear swimming suits and come in earlier from our evening games of Prisoner's Base and Run Sheep Run. I was very thankful that I was a boy.
How do you play Run Sheep Run?
I've never heard of Run Sheep Run. Despite mowing lawns and working in my war garden, I had many additional hours to spend with my pets, watching my woodchucks nibbling clover, feeding my 4 yearling skunks their bread and milk, and trying to keep Po the crow from stealing bright objects such as car keys.
What are car keys? I thought you said car keys. I'm like, what?
Most satisfying of all were the hours that I spent with my small raccoon, whom I had named Rascal. Perhaps the psychologist might say that I had substituted pets for a family. I had a human family, of course, interesting, well-educated, and affectionate. But mother was dead, my father often away on business trips, my brother Herschel fighting in France, and my sisters Theo and Jessica now living their adult lives. Both sisters had taken tender care of me after mother died, Jessica in particular postponing her career and marriage. But now Theo was happily wed to a young paper mill owner in northern Minnesota, and Jessica, a talented linguist and poet, was taking postgraduate work at the University of Chicago. Often the only occupant of our 10-room house was an 11-year-old boy working on his canoe in the living room and thinking long, long thoughts. One problem that puzzled me was theological. I asked myself how God could be all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-merciful, and still allow so much suffering in the world. In particular, how could he have taken my gifted and gentle mother when she was only 47 years old? I asked some of these questions of Reverend Hooton, the Methodist minister whose church and parsonage adjoined our property, and his answers were not particularly satisfying. It seemed to me unfair that she could not have lived to see the pets I was raising, Rascal especially. I could imagine her pleasure, both as a biologist and as a mother. She would have been interested in studying more closely the habits of all these animals, and would have helped me solve some of the difficult problems they presented. For instance, both my crow and my skunks were currently in trouble with the Methodists. Po the crow lived in the belfry of the church, and shouted the only phrase he knew, "What fun! What fun!" as dignified parishioners came to church services, weddings, and funerals. There was one faction of the church in favor of evicting Po with a shotgun, if necessary. My harmless skunks had further complicated matters on a recent Sunday evening. These pleasant pets that I had dug from a hole the previous spring were now more than a year old and somewhat restless. They were handsome, glossy creatures, one broad stripe, one narrow stripe, one short stripe, and one black beauty with a single star of white on his head. All four had perfect manners. Having never been frightened or abused, they had never scented up the neighborhood. But one night in June, when Wowzer must have been drowsing, a stray dog came barking and snarling at them through the woven wire, and they reacted predictably. Sunday services were progressing at the church not 70 feet from their cage. It was a warm evening, and the windows of the choir loft were open. For the first time in his life, Reverend Hooton shortened his sermon. On Monday morning, a delegation of deacons came to protest to my father. With both Poe and the skunks at issue, I was in double jeopardy, so I decided to make an accommodation. I gave all my skunks a last meal of bread and milk and took them in 2 carrying baskets to Wentworth's woods, where there were many empty dens to hide in. The Methodists were so pleased to be rid of the skunks that they decided to postpone indefinitely the eviction of Poe the Crow. Rascal, meantime, was living in a hole some 5 feet above the ground in our big red oak tree, since raccoons usually stay in their nest for the first 2 months of their lives. I saw little of my pet, except when I took him out to feed him. I soon taught him how to drink his warm milk from a saucer, which was a great improvement over the laborious process of letting him nurse through a wheat straw. Wowzer was his guardian, remaining almost constantly at the foot of the oak tree, even sleeping there at night. But on an afternoon in mid-June, Wowzer and I were both alerted by a quavering trill at the hole in the tree, and there we saw a small black mask and 2 beady eyes peering out at the wide world beyond. A moment later, Rascal had executed an about-face and was emerging from the hole, ringtail first, backing down the tree cautiously in the manner of a little bear. Raccoons have 5 unretractable claws on each of their hands and feet, making headlong descent inadvisable, so Rascal instinctively came down tail first, scrambling frantically from time to time, and often looking over his shoulder to see how far he was from the ground. Wowzer was very much disturbed, and yelped a few questions, looking up to see how I felt about this new problem. I told my St. Bernard not to worry, just to wait and watch. Rascal must have been surveying the backyard very thoroughly from his front door, for he started immediately for my shallow, cemented bait pond, always alive with minnows. The edges of this pool slanted gradually toward the deeper central portion, making it convenient for my amazingly confident little raccoon. Without a moment's hesitation, he waded in and began feeling all over the bottom, his sensitive, prehensile fingers telling him all that he needed to know about this minnow pond. Meanwhile, his eyes seemed to focus on the far horizon, as though eyes and hands were in no way connected. Shiners and chubs dashed frantically for safety, sometimes leaping clear of the water in their attempt to escape. As Rascal methodically circled the pool on his first fishing expedition, I marveled that one so young, and with no mother to teach him, knew precisely the technique used by all other raccoons for catching minnows. I watched, fascinated, to see if some ancient wisdom stored within his brain would make his search successful. My answer came a moment later, when those 2 clever little black hands seized a 4-inch shiner. Then the washing ceremony began. Although the minnow was perfectly clean, Rascal sloshed it back and forth for several minutes before retiring to dry land to enjoy his meal. More delicious because he had caught this fish himself. Seemingly satisfied with the 1 minnow and aware he could catch more any time he wished, Rascal began a leisurely tour of the backyard, sniffing and feeling. There were interesting odors to be classified, odors of cats and dog, woodchuck, and recently evicted skunk. There were crickets in the grass worthy of a pounce, and the chilling shadow of Poe the Crow, which for a passing moment froze Rascal in his tracks, just as a meadow mouse will freeze in the shadow of a hawk. When Rascal came too near to any of our property lines, Wowzer went into action, nudging him back toward the tree. Rascal responded mildly to this discipline, and after another 15 minutes examining his domain, the small lord of the manor returned to his castle, climbed the tree more easily than he had descended, and disappeared into his hole. I decided one day that Rascal was clean enough and bright enough to eat with us at the table. I went to the attic and brought down the family high chair last used during my own infancy. Next morning, while my father was fixing eggs, toast, and coffee, I went out to get Rascal and placed him in the high chair beside me at the table. On his tray, I put a heavy earthenware bowl of warm milk. Rascal could reach the milk easily by standing in the chair and placing his hands on the edge of the tray. He seemed to like the new arrangement and chirred and trilled his satisfaction. Except for dribbling a little milk, easily wiped from the tray of the high chair, his table manners proved excellent, much better than those of most children. My father was amused and permissive as usual, and even petted the raccoon as we finished our meal. Breakfast for 3 became part of the daily ritual, and we had no trouble whatsoever, until I had the idea of offering Rascal a sugar loaf. It is true we were at war, observing heatless, meatless, and wheatless days and conserving sugar, but my father and I did no baking and used almost none of our sugar ration, save for a lump or two in coffee, so I did not feel too unpatriotic when I gave Rascal his first sugar. Rascal felt it, sniffed it, and then began his usual washing ceremony, swishing it back and forth through his bowl of milk. In a few moments, of course, it melted entirely away, and a more surprised little coon you have never seen in your life. He felt all over the bottom of the bowl to see if he had dropped it, then turned over his right hand to assure himself it was empty, then examined his left hand in the same manner. Finally, he looked at me and trilled a shrill question, who had stolen his sugar lump? Recovering from laughter, I gave him a second sugar lump, which Rascal examined minutely. He started to wash it, but hesitated. A very shrewd look came into his bright black eyes, and instead of washing away a second treat, he took it directly to his mouth, where he began to munch it with complete satisfaction. When Rascal had learned a lesson, he had learned it for life. Never again did he wash a lump of sugar. His intelligence, however, created many problems. For instance, he had seen the source of the sugar, the covered bowl in the middle of the table. And whereas I had previously been able to confine him to his high chair, he now insisted upon walking across the tablecloth, lifting the lid of the sugar bowl and helping himself to a lump. From that day on, we had to keep the sugar bowl in the corner cupboard to avoid having a small raccoon constantly on the dining room table. Another lesson he learned swiftly was how to open the back screen door. I purposely had not repaired the catch or replaced the weekend spring because all of my cats like to open the door and walk in, or push it from inside and let themselves out again. Rascal watched this performance several times. Obviously, the trick was to hook your claws into the screen and pull. Feeling very pleased with himself, he showed the cats he was as smart as the oldest and wisest Tom. Several nights later, I was startled and delighted to hear Rascal's trill from the pillow beside me, and then to feel his little hands working all over my face. My raccoon baby had climbed from his hole, opened the back screen door, and with eyes that could see in the dark had found his way to my bed. There were no strict rules in our house, as both Rascal and I realized. My raccoon had decided that the very best place to sleep was with me. He was as clean as any cat, housebroken immediately and without training, and he thought my bed was softer and more comfortable than his own in the oak tree. So from that night on, we became bedfellows, and for many months we slept together. I felt less lonesome now when my father was away. Cable stories in the Janesville Daily Gazette admitted that the Germans had reached the banks of the Marne and were within sight of the Eiffel Tower. On the big war map in the window of the Tobacco Exchange Bank, the black-headed pins representing the German lines were in several places, pushing back the red, white, and blue pins which indicated various Allied sectors. Somewhere in that storm of lead and steel, my brother Herschel was fighting. Among my favorite poems at this time were Rupert Brooke's War Sonnets and Alan Seeger's Prophetic and Gallant Lament. I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. Particularly on nights of thunder and lightning, I had nightmares about the war and pulled the covers over our heads. But when the sun arose the next morning to shine upon the rain-wet grass, Rascal and I forgot our fears and prepared to go fishing. One of my favorite fishing spots was a sandbar below the Indian Ford Dam in Rock River, a stream which rises in the Hurricane marshes of Wisconsin and enters the Mississippi at Rock Island, Illinois. There were deep holes and rapids, marshy bayous, and stretches as quiet as a lake, a beautiful and unpredictable stream. On a previous evening, I had searched the wet lawn with a flashlight to catch more than 50 night crawlers. My jointed steel rod was strapped under the bar of my bicycle, and my tackle box with reel and line and lures was ready to place in the bicycle basket on the handlebars. It was good that my box was small and compact, leaving room for my fishing companion, who in the last few days had become a cycling maniac. Rascal was a demon for speed. Weighing 2 pounds at most, this absurd and lovable little creature had the heart of a lion. He had learned to stand in the closely woven wire basket with his feet wide apart and his hands firmly gripping the front rim, his small button of a nose pointed straight into the wind and his ringtail streaming back like the plume of a hunting dog that has come to a point. The most amusing aspect of his racing costume was his natural black goggles around his bright eyes, making him look like Barney Oldfield coming down the home stretch. What he liked best was going full tilt down a steep hill. It worried him slightly when I had to work hard, pumping up the next hill, the front wheel woggling from side to side to keep the bicycle in balance. But as we picked up speed again, his confidence returned, and he would peer ahead like the engineer leaning from the cab window of old 99. On the southern edge of town we had to pass the cemetery, where my mother was buried under a white stone that said, "In memory of Sarah Elizabeth Nelson North, 1866 to 1914. It seemed an inadequate tribute, only partially compensated by the roses I had planted there. From the cemetery it was all downhill to Indian Ford, with a fine view of the winding river bordered by woods and pastures and neat geometric fields of corn, tobacco, wheat, and oats. In these years of war prosperity, the barns were newly painted a cheerful red, and the farmhouses white amid wide lawns and flowers. We gained speed in those last 2 miles, and Rascal came to full attention, the wind sweeping into his face and blowing his whiskers back to his furry ears. We were probably as happy as anyone can be in our world. This was the first time Rascal had seen Indian Ford, and there were many exciting things to show him. The bridge with girders rising 20 feet above the water from which boys dared each other to dive. The dam itself with a shining sheet of water cascading into the depths below. The powerhouse from which emerged the continuous purring of the dynamos. And finally the swift tail race, too dangerous for any swimmer, particularly for a small raccoon who had barely learned to doggy paddle. We turned downriver on a path skirted by willows in which red-winged blackbirds made the day still more liquid with their con-curee, and upon a bank overlooking a bend in the big stream we found wild strawberries almost as bright as the red epaulets on the wings of the blackbirds. A single taste of these berries, and Rascal waded into the patch, snatching and devouring. For one so eager and so curious, each moment brought new delights. We came at last to my secret fishing place, the sandbar with a deep and quiet hole below it, where I had caught more fish than anywhere else in the river. I left my bicycle in the willows and began assembling my jointed pole and reel, running my silk line through the agate eyes and tip, and tying to that line a short gut leader, a swivel, and a red and white bass plug. We're going to stop here for now. This is a very long chapter, and I will pick up where we left off next time.